At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Marcus, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Dr. Doug, that's okay.
Yeah, or Doug, that's fine. You know,
All
it's just fascinating to me, the backgrounds of how people kind of reach the point that they are in their lives and what they're doing. And obviously, you're doing something extremely significant. I'd love for you to share with the audience a little bit about who you are and help them to understand who you are, a little bit of your background.
Okay. I'll talk about what I do, and then I'll talk about how I got here.
Okay.
I work with Certain Future, and I support parents of preteens. So I support the parents of the preteens, 10 to 14 years old, so they can show up and maintain a meaningful relationship with their child during their first identity breaking, I call it. And we could talk about what identity breaking is later.
Right.
And I work with the parents so that these are parents who know the value of doing hard work. And when I say that, we were all adolescents, yeah, and we know those formative years, but when you're present with your son or daughter through those years, you can lay the foundation that will pay later on in life. So I use a framework called the Show Up Framework, and it's so that they can be confident in their communication and they can know how to be present when their child starts to withdraw and how to support their child so they can develop strong resilience and self-belief.
So how on earth did you get on this path?
Oh man, several different origin stories actually, and I'll just be the quick
No, please,
overview.
sure, I'm interested.
Are you familiar with the term third culture kid?
No.
Have you heard it? Okay, so a third culture kid is usually, there are different definitions, but usually their passport doesn't match the country they grew up with or their parents' identity, culture, let's say. So my mom's from the Philippines, my dad's from the Bahamas, that's why I live in the Bahamas, and I was born in California. I lived here until I was 12, and then I moved to the Bahamas, studied communication in Alabama, journalism, right? Straightway went to South Korea to be a missionary English teacher. Stopped being a missionary, no animosity towards a church or anything, but worldviews change, and then, but loved teaching. And I continued teaching, got my training inside Thailand, went and taught at a petrol company in Saudi Arabia, came back to Thailand, furthered my education, then went to Spain, then did 7 years inside Thailand, taught in international schools. English language arts is what I taught. And then now I'm back in the Bahamas with my aging parents. And I taught English. And I remember coming out of English class one time and I told my chairperson, I said, you know what? This feels a lot like therapy. And he said, Marcus, that's why it's called the humanities. We're teaching them how to be human. And I love communication. I love words. Our words create our world. And in human development, it's always during the transition years. That's adolescence, when we're entering adolescence, when we're entering young adulthood, then our golden years and so on. But it's during those formative years that we are asked, you know, who are you? And that we really get to form our identity. And I've worked with teenagers and preteens. This is a book from my fifth graders. Can't see it on screen. I'll fix it.
No, that's okay.
That's all right. My fifth and sixth graders. This is the Good Vibe book that they gave me. And there are a lot of pictures of just stick men with afros. I'll show you here. Just wonderful. I do it for them also.
Okay, cool.
Just, you know, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life, but I'm going to serve parents because also it's my own upbringing with my father, a father who really cared, an A-type personality. And in retrospect, there's wisdom to say how he showed up for me. And there's gratitude behind it. But then him being the adult in the room, like growing up, I always knew like, dude, no, that's not how you do it. But the people who know our insecurities first is ourselves, and the ones who know it best are our kids.
Right.
But those are just several different ways of how I found myself here. I feel uniquely called to this, and that's the origin story. And I have a vision going forward too. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. I have four children. So
Hey. Yeah.
yeah, I've got four kids. And it's interesting as you look at, as you say, the pre-teenage years, which what age would you put that in for preteens for the audience? What age?
10,
Eight,
10 to 14.
10 to
And
14?
and the reason I say that because people develop at different stages of life.
Uh-huh.
Everybody's different in their development. And now with social media, people are actually developing a bit faster, but I'd say 10 to 14. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So here's a question I have for you, because
Mhm.
as I've done some studies, I have seen that between the ages of birth and about 8 to 10,
Mhm.
personalities are created, and many times, as the research shows, much of the time those personalities are created by the imprints of the parents, of the religion, of the society, of the school, of the teachers, of the friends, and all of that. So they get to be age 8 to 10,
Mhm.
and you're trying to deal with them in a certain manner, and they have an entirely different perception of what's going on.
Mhm.
And sometimes as adults we don't understand that. And the other challenge is a lot of times their reaction to what we would consider just a normal communication, they have a huge emotional reaction, and it has nothing to do with that time of moment. It has everything to do with some subconscious imprint that brought up an emotion that now they're going to fight back. What are your thoughts on that, Marcus?
I would say you're a very intuitive parent, and I'll give some you gave a nice skeleton and I'll add some details to help
Okay,
it make
great.
sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's think about it. 0 to let's say 8 and 10.
Uh-huh.
The world is black and white for them in that it's your worldview. They're believing everything that you say and you're telling them. Um, Adolescence is actually it's a natural part of life where they're going to start forming their own identity. And what
Right.
happens, and you notice this, that's where actually skepticism starts to seep in as they start to understand there are other perspectives in the world. Oftentimes nowadays it's coming through media, but it used to come
Right.
through adults inside, other trustworthy adults inside our communities, their peers. And as they interact with other people that aren't their family group, they start to say, oh no, people look at life differently than my parents do. And they haven't learned nuance yet, which comes later on in life, 18 about. But while they're not sure everything you're telling them is the truth, right? And I say an
Right.
ice wall, a wall of ice forms, and it's ICE. These are the challenges of preteens, or when they're breaking away into adolescence. I is identity breaking. Who am I? Right? I used to be mom or dad's like loving son or daughter. And what maternal energy does, it holds you close. It says, I love you, you're cared for, you're secure, you're safe, you're seen. What paternal energy does is it pushes a child away. And it says, I love you, you're safe, you're secure, you're seen. You can come back, but I need you to be independent. First, you're dependent, now you're independent. The final form, actually, of human development is interdependence. As Jim
Yes.
Rohn says, I will take care of me to be in service to you if you promise to take care of you to be in service to me.
Yes.
That's the final form. But now they need to practice independence of figuring out who you are. And that tension creates a whole holistic human being, right? That push and pull. But it's that breaking away of which they're trying to navigate and trying to figure out their role, their identity. The second thing is collaborative mistrust. They don't know who to work with or who's on their team now. And they think they're the problem. Um, the third thing, and you touched on it, is emotional mismanagement. Emotions tell us, one, our subjective well being, how we're moving towards the goals in our lives, and how we're navigating this. This is their first time to the rodeo, so they don't know how to manage it yet. Um, and in order to melt this wall of ice, it's like Angela Duckworth says. Duckworth said from Grit, every kid needs one psychological wise adult inside their life who will show up and that's where I came up with the framework, show up framework. But to answer your question, that is where all this preteen dysregulation comes from.
Well, and it becomes a real challenge. You talk about your dad had, I think, an A personality. If you get into the behavioral analyses, you've got the DISC test, the DISC, and so forth. I look at A as a D, and for me, I'm a high D. High D, and if you're familiar with those at all, but it just means that I have strong opinions and I'm willing to speak them out whenever. I don't care if they ask for it or not. And I had to learn with my kids very on, and we were fortunate that we had some good communication, but I had to learn very early on that because of my personality, I had to say, all right, kids, do you want me to listen? Or do you want my opinion? and that was, everybody laughs about it now, but the reality is I still have to do that. And, they're from 26 to 40, so it just gets to be fascinating.
Are you familiar with Charles Duhigg, who wrote The Power of Habit?
Charles
Duhigg.
I'm not, no.
Okay. So he just wrote a new book called Super Communicators. And it just reminded me of, he says, there are three reasons we enter into purpose. We enter into a conversation. Either it's information exchange, either it's emotional exchange, or it's just, what was the third one? Oh, just for like social lubrication. That's when we're talking about the weather.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it's because we're not aware of the purpose of the conversation. We're like, you'll have of just steamrolling of, okay, do you want this opinion or do you want me just to listen? But it's like knowing your role and purpose of the conversation, feeling or reading the room. It could save a lot of heartache, let's say. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. And, I think one of the challenges, and I'll be curious whether you use this or not, one of the challenges is to really, we all have as adults, we have a purpose, and, some people have it, some don't. But we also have specific values, whether or not we're aware of them, they definitely do cause our behavior and, run that to a large degree. And yet with our children, we assume that they have the same values, the same motivators, the same, personality type and so forth. And the reality is that they're so different. I don't, do you ever do any behavioral analyses as you start to work with the parents with their kids?
So a lot of my work comes from positive psychology. So we're doing VIA, virtues in action, because we're starting off with the identity of the child.
Yes.
And so so everything that I do stems from virtues and values. And those actually mean something specific. Virtues, are you familiar with the virtues in action?
Oh, please explain to the audience.
Well, I was I can't explain it when I explain that, but you were making a point before we went off. So I'll let you finish your point. If that's
Well,
okay.
I think my point, and like I say, years ago, I got into this behavioral analyses type of thing and the one that I use now, which I had found a few years ago, not only gets into the personality, are they extroverts, introverts, right brain, left brain combinations, so forth, but it also gets into their values. It gets into their motivators, and it's not something that pegs someone because people can change and this can change. But the reality is it helps us to know who we are and who the child is and understand that all of a sudden, wow, their motivators, their values aren't the same as mine. And when that happens, I think for parents, that becomes an extremely difficult situation to deal with. And then all of a sudden you get all sorts of motivations and emotions and everything else. So as you work with your parents and how do you figure out where the values and those things are for the kids? And you talked about that. So go ahead and explain.
Yeah. So the S in the show up framework is start with strong identity.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing virtues and values. Now, what virtues and values are 24 characteristics that are found in all cultures, all faiths or beliefs. It's from ancient wisdom all the way to modern science.
Okay.
And these are different things like creativity, leadership, gratitude, zest, appreciation of beauty. Now, All of these virtues are with you, yet 5 of them are expressed most, right? And depending on context.
Mhm.
So, as those virtues are with you, I encourage people to act in those virtues, and also we do virtue spotting. Like we look for it and we find evidence and examples. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to solidify an identity in a person. Those are the virtues. The values, very simply, what's important to you. And like you were saying, for some parents, some things are of value, where for the kid, it's not a value. Yes. And it's worth noting when establishing our identity, we have individual identity. It's worth noting, I want to hear your input on this. Family value to say, you know, sorry, Dr. Doug, your last name?
Goldbranson. That's why I go by. That's why I go by Dr. Doug. No one can pronounce it.
Goldbranson. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you say the Goldbransons, people like us do things like this. It's collective identity. I don't know if you did that in your home or not, but
you should hear the daughter-in-laws of my children.
Okay.
You should hear my daughter-in-laws, the spouses of my children.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just the Goldbransons.
So there was even an identity, even if it wasn't intentionally put on. But yeah,
Right.
people like us. So we try to establish a family identity, just so that you're gonna break off, but you have a place to come back to, or you're gonna do a remix. But as long as they have identity here, and then trust them to form their own identity as they're leaving. That's what we try to work on with virtues and values. Yeah.
Okay, and you talked about 5 main virtues that are obvious. What can you quote those off,
no.
or
Yeah. Well,
at
so
least a few of them? A few of them.
Sure. They're 24 in total, right? Yet
Uh-huh.
when you take the test, when you take the survey, for each individual, there are 5 that are expressed most, and that can be different variations of them.
Okay.
So for me, mine is gratitude, creativity, fairness, and I keep them on my desktop. Just to be aware of them, perspective, and perseverance. So whenever I'm faced with a challenge or resistance, how might I bring my virtues to meet? How might I meet this with my virtues? That's my thought, right?
So, and everybody doesn't have the same virtue. So,
No.
when you said there's 5, it's not that there are 5 that always show up among everyone. It's just that for each individual, there are usually about 5 virtues, whatever they happen to be.
Yeah, and that's the spice of life, right? It's a different variety, and that's why that lends to our collaboration. Yet, hold on, it's worth noting, Doug, how you know it's a virtue is that it's always acting towards either the individual well-being or the collective well-being.
Okay.
Because there could be a virtue of excess. Just humor is a virtue, but like if you're being funny in a moment where it's not necessary and it's not adding to well-being, or if you're too serious, so stern and so on, and not seeing the virtue of humor. So it's either excess or a deficiency. You're trying to get it inside that mean, right in the middle.
Yes. And you know what I find oftentimes is as I work with people, you help them to understand kind of who they are with these, assessments. But the fascinating thing is that sometimes they'll agree, sometimes they don't, and they're not perfect. So, I always say, whatever's true for you is going to be true for you. But getting into that virtue and getting into that values and recognizing that that is something that is the true motivator for an individual. How do you help parents to be able to understand those preteens from the standpoint of their virtues and their values? Do you do an assessment, or do you do something a little bit different?
So I used to be a mentor before I became a communication coach and a mentor for preteens. That's actually why I selected this group. And I would always do a VIA, Virtues in Action survey. And that's just so that I could frame the conversation as such. I feel when you frame the conversation like that, it's more empowering than oftentimes, what Dr. Hammond says is our automatic negative thoughts. Oftentimes, you frame things as just like, what you're lacking or how you're bad or something. Once I did bad, heard it forever. Twice I did good, heard it never. But when I'm speaking to you in your virtues and I'm asking you, is this the type of person you want to be? I'm creating space for your essence to emerge. And that's the root of the word or etymology of parent and education. It is bringing forth. And that's what we have to trust as parents and as educators and caregivers, that we can create the context to bring forth the beauty that is already there.
Well, and you have a lot of parents, and I think we're all guilty of this to some degree. I mean, we have our personal culture. We have what we were brought up with. And obviously, we think that's good, ideally. And so we want to share that with our children. And how do you help parents to get over that resistance of I'm right and you're wrong, number one, and number two, you're just a child, I know what's best for you? How do you help them to get to the point where they will sit back, be open, be non-judgmental, and actually seek out what is that child's virtue? What are the virtues? What are their values? And then how do you help them to help those children to achieve the highest level of those rather than that constant pushback of, no, this is how you need to be?
I, oh boy. First of all, I would give another perspective in that that resistance is needed, because our true identity is not expressed until it is challenged. And that is said for the parent as well as for the child. Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, that's all right.
Sorry about that. I turned that off.
That's all right. All right.
Here we go.
In communications, we're taught in all relationships, there's challenge or there's conflict. Conflict doesn't define the relationship. Rather, how we manage the conflict does.
Yes.
Yeah. Your kid is going to push back. You may feel you do have more life experience than your kid, but you're not there to be right. What you're there to do is to, one, create the space for your child to become a whole child, for the role that they're living there, a whole adolescent. And for two, for you to understand more about life. Whenever we have a funky feeling, and this is just wisdom speaking, but whenever we have a bad feeling, anger, envy, jealousy, wanting to control, or frustration, it's never the thing, honestly. It's our relationship with the thing. And oftentimes it's linked back to, what am I not willing to accept? That's a tough pill to swallow. And I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
What am I willing to accept about myself?
About the situation, or what am I not willing to accept?
Oh yeah, and yeah, I mean, setting boundaries is, I think, important. But again, what I see happening, I mean, my experience with my kids was entirely different. I grew up in a family where we were all very independent. My dad worked so hard at the university that, we didn't see him very often. He told us we had our jobs to do and so forth. And so we became very independent, and my mom was great, but they really taught us the independence. So I did the same thing for my kids. And I told them right off the bat, you know what? When they got to the preteen years and almost teen years, it's like, do you have a curfew? No. But I want you. I'm telling this to my kids. Do you have a curfew? And it's like, I'm not going to set a major curfew, but I'd appreciate it if you're home by 11 or by 12. And if you're going to be later, call me and let me know what's going on. And you know what? Right now, they are so independent that it's just fascinating to see how they literally, do their things. That's kind of what the daughters-in-law all say is, you guys are so friggin' independent. We'll go on a family trip and everybody goes a different way.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
where there's a family, then no, I'm going to go to this, I'm going to go do that. Okay, bye bye. See you later tonight, and so forth. So I think it becomes a challenge to be able to get to the point where number one, you become non-judgmental.
Yes.
I think the judgmental attitude really, our kids pick it up. As as you talk about communication, yeah, the words are what, 15%, but now you have the tonality and you have the
Hmm.
body language, which is even bigger. So I think a lot of times, working with parents, and as we see parents communicating with their kids, they may think they're saying the right words, but in reality, if they have not worked on themselves first, they're going to come across, and the perception from their children is going to be an entirely different thing than what the parent thought it was going to be.
Yeah. I always say, be mindful of the voice with which we speak to children, for in time that becomes a voice with which they speak to themselves. And yeah, if you hold that tone, if you hold those certain words, that's received by them. To touch on a point you mentioned earlier, each family, each household does it differently.
Oh, yeah.
And I think even speaking with you now, knowing how the spaces you create, I can understand your sons and do you have any daughters? I don't know, but your
I have one
children.
daughter. Yeah, she's
Okay.
26.
They have a space to express themselves, right? I think when you're speaking about, we do need boundaries, you do need rules and regulations because things grow in boundaries. Um, Ideally at the preteen age, and this is not to say someone did it right or wrong, but ideally at the preteen age, yeah, you want them to have child voice and child choice to understand that they have some say in this, and it's not just what I say is law, you know? So
Yeah.
then ideally, like they have some say in it, and you can have a conversation back and forth. Again, them knowing that their well-being is in mind. The reason we're doing this is for your well-being. But yeah.
Well, and again, going back to that, how do you help parents?
Mhm.
I'm sure you meet a variety of different personalities and different attitudes and so forth. How do you
Sure.
help parents to get to the point where they will approach this from the perspective that you talk about and do it in a way that allows them to maybe understand themselves a little bit more, and even just as important is to understand their child so that they can support their child rather than try to necessarily misguide them.
Well, I'll tell you this much, and this comes from Dan Siegel. Um, I- I'll say this, but then I'll answer the question you asked. But
Okay.
you are going to misguide them. You're not going to be a perfect. No one's going to be a perfect parent,
Right.
but and that's actually a feature, not a flaw, I think. Uh, you have to mess up the pattern a bit to create a rupture, to create reconnection. That's what I think, because that's what human development is. It's progressive. In order to progress, there has to be some breaking. Like Ernest Hemingway said, life breaks us all, and some people are made whole in the broken places.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be a perfect parent. Let's establish
No,
that
that's true.
first. Yeah. So how do I help them? In the show up framework, it looks at human development, and the first one is start with a strong identity, right? The
Okay.
H is hold space for collaboration. When they have this wall of ice, they don't know who to trust because oftentimes when they have problems or experience problems, they think, what's wrong with me? That creates contention between the parent and the child because oftentimes the parent is looking at the kid like, why aren't you meeting my expectations? If a kid's not meeting expectations, it's only one of two things. Either they don't feel supported or they don't have the skills to do it.
What about they just choose not to do it because it's not important to them?
A, and that's very valid, right?
Yeah.
Um, in the framework, because after that, you ask them, I'm noticing this as a challenge. What are your ideas on it? And you're inviting them into the conversation to give their ideas and their thoughts on it because you're absolutely right. It might not be a value for them. Um, Cleaning their room may not be the thing that they're interested in at the moment. Now that opens up the conversation of the parent saying, this is why it's a value to me because, again, we're looking at well being. And we can only work on one piece to correct at a time. So maybe having a clean room may not be the priority at the moment. It might be something else in regards to sleep or finishing homework or so on, right?
Right.
But you're right. You're right. It opens up the conversation to say, let's look at what we value. And then after having the expectations and the regulations set by the parent, we collaboratively work on a solution, something that you can agree upon and that I can agree upon, and we try it for some time, right? So that they feel part of the process of saying, when
Right.
there are challenges, I have a voice in it, right? So that's the H of the show up framework. And then O is open up communication, and W is wander and explore the world together. That means having projects, our personal ones and the ones that our kids have, like Angela Duckworth says, doing something difficult for a long period, because that's teaching them grit, teaching them how to do hard things. And in teaching them that, you're showing that you have projects and they have projects and happy people have projects. Sonia Livermirsky. But you're showing them how to use their virtues and values to reaffirm their identity doing something they want to do in the world. And that is moving towards maturity.
Well, and it's so interesting you talk about that unveiling potential together, wonder and exploring the world together. What does that do let's look at the underlying reality
Sure.
of what does that do when a parent is willing to spend the time with their child, doing things that hopefully the child enjoys. And what does that do for the relationship, and how does that help overall for the parent to help that teenager or that preteen to move forward a little bit better?
Well, if we want to play the long game, Doug, do you know when people are happiest in life?
The long game?
it's it is around right after 40, 50, 60, when they still have their health, disposable income, empty nesters in a sense, so they can
Uh-huh.
still use their money, but they still have some life and vitality. And the reason I mention that is because they know it's either they know they played well and they fed into their kid's life, or they live with regret. So it actually diverges.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention that is because I think what parents want, those who want to bring forth greatness, you want kids who are a contributor to society to make this a better place, right? Your progeny does
Right.
better than you do, right? When you're teaching them about projects and about how to give back to the community, you can rest easier in your wise age, knowing that you showed up for your kid. You did an honest effort there. That's the long game. In the moment, it feels good to see yourself achieve. You're making progress step by step. Yeah, I think that's when you ask me what does it do? I think, yeah, you seeing yourself progressing, that feels good.
Yeah, and I think it develops, when we talk about communication, and in my mind, the most important thing in raising our children is having, and that's your number three, is having that open communication. And if you have that where they literally can come to you and say, hey, I've got a problem, I want to talk to you about it, they have to understand that they can trust that you will listen and that you will not necessarily judge. You may disagree, but you won't judge. And then be able to offer them, if they seek it, some thoughts and some advice about that. How do you help the parent to get to that point? I mean, we're dealing with parents, myself included. We have our own emotional junk that we deal with all of the time. How do you help the parents to get to that point of beingness so that they can help their child to become the person they really want to be?
um, in the show up framework, what I call it is a trustworthy present parent. Because as a kid puts up their wall of ice, it's the fact of you being there ready for when your kid does come from behind that wall, right? And trust is built over time,
Yes.
right? It can be lost in a moment, yet it's built over time. Now, one tactic I can give you So the strategy is to be present and to be someone you can trust. Now, trust is built on three things. First of all, you have to be telling the truth first. All growth begins with telling the truth. Second, your line of thinking has to make sense to them, right? And the third is they have to know you care. They have to know that you're actually working for their well-being, right? Now, that said, one tactic, one way you could do it is the way you communicate with them. I'll tell you a speaking one, and then I'll tell you a writing one. A speaking one is, how do you pass on your virtues and values without being preachy? If you see them going through a challenge, tell them a story, not just any story. Tell them a story that is yours. Ideally, it's a story that is yours when you're the same age. Identify with them so that it's, hey, this is what I experienced. Now, stories actually happen in 3 seconds. Stories just means your belief changed and you gave it meaning. I have an example, but just looking at a top level, your beliefs changed. This is what it means to you. And then you invite them into the conversation, say, what does this mean to you? Because now you're telling them, this is what I believe because of this story that happened to me. And this is why I hold the values I do. What are your thoughts? And when they tell their thoughts, actually make space for them to express themselves. It's not you arguing with them. They might tell you something new that you never even thought of. Or they might say, no, I see why you could see it like that. Or I understand you more. So that's one way to share your virtues and values without being preachy in conversation.
Well, and it really does get down to being open, to know how to communicate and have your own emotions in control so that you're not judgmental, so you don't get upset, you don't get angry. Hey, Dad, this is what I really believe. This is what I want to do. And it may be the antithesis of what I wanted to instill in them, and yet that's who they are. And that gets to be a challenge.
It gets to be a challenge when you're not accepting, when they hold a view that's different from yours.
Yes.
I agree with you on that.
And I see a lot of kids, particularly in this area, see a lot of kids kicked out of their house because they're not living up to the religious virtues of their parents. And, to me, that's such a challenge. And I think how do we help parents to understand that each of our children are individuals? Yeah, they were made up between a man and a woman, but how do we literally get to the point where we give them their independence, we give them their strength, and yet understanding that at that age, some wise counsel and, watching out for them is important too.
I wonder if one of the biggest, I don't know, I'm thinking about hearing how you're framing it and being familiar with the context of how you're saying it. If we tell a person they're less than because they don't believe what we believe, like that for me, that has inherent judgment,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The writing technique I wanted to share with you. Remember, where your attention goes, your energy flows. So we have this one exercise where we're writing a letter and we're speaking about the virtues that our kids hold. And we're saying how we are proud of these virtues that we saw in them. And we're actually just drawing their awareness to something we saw.
Uh-huh.
So we're owning it, but it's like, I see this in you. And then you end the letter with, when you're ready, or if you want to, bring this letter back to me, and you will get 10 minutes or however minutes you want of my undivided attention, and I will listen with no judgment. What you're doing there is you're anchoring a point of psychological safety, whereas they can be themselves authentically without fear of being hurt or being threatened. And they know that they're supported when they're ready. And when that moment of readiness might come, maybe they might use a letter. And even if they don't use a letter, you've communicated to them, you can always come back to me when you're ready.
Well, and I love that. To me, that's kind of the foundation of how do you start to open up that communication and give that child enough trust in you that they're really willing to talk. And I think that's so important. So as we come to a close, what would you say a message would be that you would like to share with parents that might be meaningful to them as they're dealing with the challenges of pre-teenagers?
Oftentimes, what just came to mind was, I'm here to help you be in integrity with yourself, or like keep your stuff together, because your kids are going to dysregulate you. That's why I work with parents of preteens. I really do believe there's no greater privilege than to be who you are. And the duty of privilege is complete integrity. So I try to help parents be in integrity.
And as
That
parents,
said,
as parents become integrity, it shuffles off onto the kids, doesn't it?
yes, and um, have a sincere care for bringing forth what your child wants to express. Or like, let me see how I can say this. Sincerely work to their authentic expression. And even if they may go waywardly, what you're asked to do is to be faithful, like for you to be in integrity, to be faithful. And what do I mean by that? The sun rises and the sun sets. The sun is the sun. The sun, that's why we call it, it's faithful, right?
Right.
And we know we can trust the sun. Some people may curse it, saying that it's too hot, but it also gives life. It also dries out. It's just the sun. The sun doesn't argue with anybody else. The sun is there for our well-being if we choose to see it as such. If you're authentically working for the well-being of something else, I think you can be at peace knowing that you did your part. But I hear myself saying that, and the well-being of someone else, well-being looks different. That's subjective. Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that you did your part, I think that, as I get together with my kids and every once in a while, all right, what kind of parent was I really? I'm watching you do this a little bit differently here and so forth. And we get into some great discussions, and I recognize those areas where I made mistakes. Not consciously, but unconsciously, I made some mistakes that I've been able to rectify later on, hopefully. But I think the reality is that if we can work on ourselves as parents and do the best we can and recognize that, yes, we're going to make mistakes and forgive ourselves, when we can do that with us, then we can do that with our preteens.
Yeah. Doug, you actually made my point. That is so right. Whenever there's a rupture, work towards repair and reconnection. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, I really appreciate you being on the show. This is fascinating.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time.
How do people find you?
MarcusHiggs.com. That's my website. On LinkedIn is actually where you'll find me posting on social media. I have workshops coming up there. But connect with me on LinkedIn or Marcus.
Okay, and that's Marcus, Marcus, and then Higgs, Higgs.
Correct.
Perfect. Marcus, thanks so much for being on the show. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Doug.
You bet. Folks, thanks for listening. Hope you'll have a wonderful week. I hope there's something that's been said here that might make a difference in your life if you're willing to really look at it and check it out. So this is Dr. Doug saying namaste.